I am, as Maggie said, I'm Willie Dodson. I'm the Central Appalachian Field Coordinator for App Voices. I work out of our Norton office. Um, my job has to do with community organizing and advocacy around the impacts of coal mining in our region. But mushrooms are a passion of mine and have been something I've been excited about really my whole life, and really kind of studying on for about 8 years. So I am here in my room with a whole bunch of like mushroom show and tell stuff all splayed out on my bed here. But I think I'm gonna start by, I put together a little slideshow. I'm gonna go ahead and share the slideshow and maybe go through all of that and then do some show and tell, or I might kind of bounce back and forth. We'll see. But let me see if I can do this right. Share my screen. Okay, there's my screen. Present. Cool. So, gonna go through 6 or 8 different mushrooms that are common mushrooms that I find in the woods around here. How I identify them, how I like to use them. Poisonous lookalikes of these mushrooms that we need to avoid, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. On this screen here, I'll just some of these mushrooms aren't featured in the rest of the slideshow, so I'll just say what they are. That in the middle there, where we have the orange and the blue, these are chanterelle mushrooms. We'll talk about those a little bit later. This is called a blue indigo, or I mean an indigo milky cap or a blue milky cap. We're not going to get into those, unfortunately. They're not great beginner mushrooms because there's a lot of lookalikes, but there's a whole world of these mushrooms that produce milk when you cut them or bruise them. They kind of produce this little white latex thing, and the blue milk cap is just a really beautiful one. This here, the witch's hat, as I like to call it, is of course a morel, which is probably the most well-known wild edible in our region. And then on the far side over there, that's a turkey tail mushroom, which is not edible. It's a parchment type mushroom. It's like a thick cardstock kind of texture. You really couldn't eat it. But people make soup stock out of it, and it makes a really rich mushroom flavor. And it also is reported to have all kinds of medicinal properties, anti-cancer properties, anti-inflammatory properties. If I'm not mistaken, this is the one that there's been studies, clinical studies that showed that it can inhibit the way your body wants to build capillaries to feed tumors. And that's one of the ways that it has an anti-cancer effect is cancer will trick your body into saying, hey, I'm your body, you need to feed me. And this kind of helps rip the veil off. So it's pretty incredible mushroom, really common, really beautiful. Yeah, so that's me. In addition to App Voices, my little side hustle is called Little Dog Forest Farm. If anybody wants to look me up on Facebook or Instagram, I'm based in far Southwest Virginia and Northeast Tennessee. So I have mushrooms and ramps and stuff for sale different times of the year. You can find me on the social media there. That's a puffball mushroom I've got in my hands there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So the main ways that I identify mushrooms are these 4 things here, and there's other factors too that get more into specific, but obviously the most notable thing is color. And you'll notice that there's some really bright colored mushrooms in this presentation because they catch my eye, and they're a little bit easier to spot than the ones that are earth toned. There's some really delicious black and brown mushrooms out there too, but they're just harder to find and harder to teach about than orange and red ones. Most folks, when you think about a mushroom, you think about like a toadstool, like a cap, which is or a stalk, which is called a stipe, and a cap. and then the cap has gills underneath. There's a lot of that. There's also a lot of mushrooms that are called polypores, which just have a pore surface underneath, just bunches of tiny little circles. And the spores come out of those circles. Sometimes they're so small you can't see them. Sometimes they're fairly large. The form of the mushroom sometimes is a shelf that comes right out of a tree. There's also really wild looking mushrooms that look like corals that grow underground, and various other forms that we'll talk about a little bit. And then finally the substrate, which on the kind of macro level basically means, is it growing out of wood or is it growing out of the ground? But then more specifically, I am also thinking about what type of forest am I in? What type of tree is this growing on or near? So we'll start with chicken of the woods. Let me make this, let's see, I forgot that y'all are seeing what I'm seeing. Can I make this go away? I made it go away. Chicken of the woods is a really fun mushroom. It's called chicken of the woods because it has a texture quite a lot like chicken. Some folks say it tastes like chicken. There's a lot of different mushrooms where people say, well, this tastes like crab meat, or this tastes like chicken, or whatever. To me, they taste like mushrooms. They taste kind of like these other things, but they mostly taste like mushrooms. But chicken of the woods is one where, depending on how you prepare it, you can really trick people, and I've done that. If you cut it into long wedges and bread it and fry it and take it to a potluck or a cookout, you know, it's chicken fingers as far as anybody knows. Especially if you get it fresh. After it's been around for a while, the texture dries out and it gets a little bit corky, and it's harder to work with in the kitchen at that point. It's not impossible, but it's hard to get it, you know, to kind of bring the texture back to a level of hydration that is pleasant. So it's really fun to hunt because, you know, you can spot it. It's orange, as you can see, and sometimes there's a lot of it. There's two pictures here. The one of me just holding one little kind of shelf of it that I broke off just to show the beautiful color. And then that other log, that particular log I found in Wise County, Virginia, and it had probably 12 pounds or something of chicken of the woods on it. I once found about 60 pounds of this mushroom in one go in Kentucky. That was the biggest single score I've ever had of really any mushroom, I think. There's a handful of varieties. There is a white variety that's white on top as well that I'm not very familiar with. I just found it this year for the first time, but generally what we're talking about is the Laetoporus sulphureus or the Laetoporus cincinnatus. Sulphureus has a yellow pore surface underneath, and the cincinnatus has a white. Some people call this mushroom sulfur shelf sometimes, and that's a reference to the yellow pore surface. Grows on dead and dying wood, usually oak. Sometimes you'll see it growing as a bunch of shelves coming directly off the wood. Sometimes you'll see it as on this log where it's kind of like a rosette coming up off the wood. And sometimes you'll see it in these rosettes coming out of the ground next to trees. But whenever you see it growing out of the ground, it in truth is growing out of the roots of the tree. It's just coming up through the dirt. There is another orange mushroom called jack-o'-lantern that doesn't look very much like this at all, but it's a mushroom you need to learn if you're going to be hunting mushrooms, because jack-o'-lantern is poisonous. And very early on in my mushroom foraging, I didn't go so far as to eat it, but I saw a bunch of orange mushrooms growing at the base of a tree, and I said, maybe that's chicken of the woods, and it was jack-o'-lantern. We'll talk about jack-o'-lantern just a little bit later on. There we go. Next one that I want to talk about is oyster mushrooms. This is also a really good mushroom to cultivate, and I'll talk about that a little bit and kind of shout out some businesses in the region that'll get you started on that. It's very, very common. Oh yeah, I didn't say about the season for that chicken of the woods. I have found it every month of the year from March until December. So it's got a really wide range, mostly more like, late April up until October, but I've found it a lot. Oyster mushrooms are the same way. I've even found oyster mushrooms frozen in the snow in January. Like they were growing, the winter came, they kind of went into suspended animation. I harvested them frozen and cooked them in soup, and they were great. The wild varieties we find kind of are white to gray to tannish, and they do have gills underneath rather than pores. The term for the form of these gills, we call it decurrent. And what that means is that it's not just under the cap and then stops promptly at the stipe. The gills kind of go down the stipe a little ways. And you can see in one of those pictures there how the stipe kind of just blossoms out into the cap. There's not a real clear distinction between the stipe and the cap. And on the other picture there, you can see that the stipe doesn't even appear to be present on those mushrooms. So that there's a lot of variation with the oyster mushrooms in terms of how much stipe is actually there. They'll grow in clusters or individually, and they grow on dead and dying hardwoods, particularly poplar and beech. I grow a lot of these, and I always grow them on beech or on poplar. I find them on beech out in the woods plenty, but I've got a good supply of poplar. That if you want to grow oyster mushrooms or shiitakes or some of the hericium mushrooms that we'll also talk about, you grow these in wood, and you need green wood. You can't get wood that's been dead for a while, because all of the kind of ambient fungus that's just out there in the world has already colonized that wood, and you're just going to be wasting the mycelium that you put into it. But I've got a good supply of poplar, so I've cut this fresh poplar. I use a chainsaw. A lot of folks use a drill to make little holes and then tap what's called plugs into the holes that you'll buy from a mushroom store. But I use a chainsaw, and I just cut a wedge out, and then I buy this mushroom spawn that's just these bags of inoculated sawdust, basically. And the smaller of these two pictures that's in the foreground, those mushrooms are growing out of a bag like that. That actually looks like that bag might have straw in it. But I pack the where I cut the wedge out with that stuff, put the wedge back, and then just wrap duct tape around it. And I'll do several of those on a log, and set them in a good shady wet spot in the woods on my property. I'll talk a little bit at the end about some stores in the region, but I just want to point out that this picture, you can see the logo here is I totally just lifted that off of Sharondale Mushroom Farm's website. They're near Charlottesville, if any of y'all are in that area, and they have all kinds of great products. So this is the one everybody knows. Morels, or in West Virginia, people like to call them moochers or molly moochers, and Southwest Virginia and Kentucky seems like folks call them dryland fish more. And in the bottom right there, you can kind of see how they get that namesake of dryland fish is you just bread them and fry them. And sometimes people say they kind of look like a little fish fillet when you do it that way. This is a real fun mushroom. Grows in the spring. In our area, it's mid-April to mid-May. Up in the north, it comes a little bit later. Usually they grow in patches. I don't know that I've ever found one and not found at least one more. The guy who first taught me about mushrooms, he'd always talk about the morel's mate. And if we found one, he'd go, okay, where's its mate? Where's its mate? And he'd be looking around, and sure enough, we'd always find it. And usually we'd find several, and sometimes quite a lot. They don't have gills or pores. As you can see, the cap is this elongated, deeply pitted surface, and the spores are produced inside those pits. These are hollow mushrooms. The stipe is hollow. The cap is hollow as well. Sometimes they'll grow in a cluster of, a couple are attached, but generally they're just isolated or in patches. there is a lookalike called Gyrometra that people call the false morel. I have found that in Kentucky and Virginia like a couple of times maybe. I spent some of last spring in Vermont, and this was all over Vermont. I didn't find a single true morel. I just found the Gyrometra. So the way you tell the difference is, while the true morels don't really have a true cap that is sitting on top of the stipe, they have this pitted hollow surface. The Gyrometra really is a stipe with a cap on top, but the cap is just curled down around the stipe in this crazy gnarly way. So what we have here is the Gyrometra or the false morel, and then up here is just the two next to each other. That's the true morel. That's the false morel. I kind of wish we could be talking. I kind of wish I could hear y'all, and people could interject with questions. Maybe I'll go ahead and take a break here, and see if anybody has any questions or any thoughts.
Yeah, Willie, there's a question in the chat asking if the false morel is edible.
Oh yeah, good question. Super fun. Sorry, I'm trying to get off of my screen share, and I'm just moving through the slideshow by mistake. So the false morel, every book I have with the Gyrometra esculenta in it says it's poisonous. However, there are videos on YouTube of people in other countries at farmers markets selling huge bins of them and eating them. So I don't know. and it seems that sometimes when people start studying mushrooms and you read the books and it says, you want it to say this is edible and this is poisonous, and then you find these ones where it says, well, it's not recommended or may be inedible. And you're like, come on, haven't we been studying the earth for hundreds of years? We haven't figured this out yet. Somehow there's just still, the verdict is still out on a lot of this stuff. My guess with the Gyrometra is that there's cultures that have been eating it for a long time that have certain enzymes and certain like genetic dispositions to where it's good food for them. And not me though. I never saw any European cultures or any people who looked like me on YouTube eating these. It was always Central and South American folks that I saw the videos of eating this mushroom. Let's see. Anybody else got any thoughts or questions while taking a break from the slideshow here? I'll come around to this image at the end that somebody has in the chat there. Okay, well, let me play a little bit of show and tell before I dive back in, because I have some morels here, and I have some chicken of the woods that I want to show y'all. So every year when I hunt my morels, it's one mushroom I never sell. I just like it too much, and I've never found enough of it that I sell any of it. But I dry a lot of it. Let's see if I can get this in the frame here. It's a really good mushroom to dry, to put in soups. It just imparts a really good flavor to the soup. And it's also such an exciting looking mushroom that it's fun in like wintertime potlucks to take a soup with morels in it and impress all your friends. And, you know, you have morels in November? Yeah. Yeah, I got morels in November. Chicken of the woods, to preserve it, you can freeze it. You can freeze it raw and just drop it frozen in the skillet. I've done that. You can also cook it and freeze it. I've done that. What I've come to really like to do with the chicken of the woods is make pot pie with it. And so when I have a bunch of it, I just make the pot pie filling and then freeze that, and then thaw that and make my chicken of the woods pot pies whenever I want them. Drying and rehydrating chicken of the woods has not been my favorite way to use it, but it is something I've done. Generally with rehydrated mushrooms, you're kind of limited to just using them in soups and sauces and stuff. But here's a little bit of chicken of the woods. You can see it's lost quite a lot of that orange color in the process of drying. And on the back, you can see that this was, or is, the sulphureous that had the yellow pore surface.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Can you freeze the mushrooms? I'm sorry if I missed that, but you have a bunch of dried ones. Can you freeze them to store them?
Yeah, chicken of the woods, I was saying, is a good one to freeze. I've done it raw and cooked them frozen.
Okay.
Raw.
Yeah.
But I like it better to cook them first. Not any mushroom though. Like oyster mushrooms are pretty delicate. So I mean, you could. Like I was saying earlier, I've found them frozen in the winter and brought them home and cooked them immediately. Any other questions before I jump back into the slideshow? Cool. I want to jump over to a medicinal mushroom. So this is the reishi mushrooms. More specifically, it's the hemlock reishi. Ganoderma tsugae. Tsugae is the name of the hemlock tree, and Ganoderma is the genus of quite a number of these shelf-like mushrooms. There's a mushroom that is popular and widely used in traditional Chinese medicine that is a different type of reishi mushroom called Ganoderma lucidum, which is called, they call it the mushroom of immortality. And it has tons and tons of uses. The main way it's kind of categorized in Western herbalism is as an adaptogen. Now, what an adaptogen is, in herbalism, we talk about herbal actions, and an action would be like garlic, herbal action, antimicrobial. Garlic just is antimicrobial. That's what it does. Chamomile is a nervine sedative. Its action is that it kind of calms you down. And most herbs have more than one action. We also talk about a digestive bitter, which kind of gets your digestive enzymes moving and helps you digest your food and helps you expel toxins and like pull the nutrients out of your food and really use them. That's what a digestive bitter herbal action is. Adaptogen is an herbal action that is not quite as straightforward, but it tends to support all systems of the body in maintaining homeostasis and maintaining adequate functioning. If something is overactive, then an adaptogen will kind of regulate it and moderate it. If something is depleted, then an adaptogen can support that organ or that system of your body or whatever it is. Another thing about adaptogens is that they tend to work synergistically with whatever other herbs they're taking with. So it's really common for reishi to be in formulas in traditional Chinese medicine. I take it every day in my own particular herbal formula. I use the hemlock reishi that I go out and forage and harvest. It's really meaningful to me to be able to harvest my own medicine. I also use some of the Ganoderma lucidum that I order from a mushroom supplier in Japan in my daily herbal stuff. We've got a lot of hemlock reishi going on in the region right now because, very sad, our hemlocks are dying. and dead and dying hemlocks are the substrate for the hemlock reishi. It's a woody shelf mushroom that grows directly on the wood. I've never seen it growing from the dirt underneath the way chicken of the woods will, you know, where it's really growing from the roots, but it comes out of the dirt. I've never seen that with reishi. I always see it just grow directly out of the wood. This past year, man, there was some hemlock woods I went to where I could have been there all day harvesting this stuff. And I did harvest quite a lot, and I probably will for the next few years, because as we have this massive reishi or hemlock die-off, we're kind of having the bumper crop of hemlock reishi right now, and then it's going to become more rare. So I'm kind of trying to stock up while I've got it. The way you make medicine with this is as a double extraction. There's certain constituents within it that are water soluble and certain that are alcohol soluble. So what you do is you make a tea with it first, because if you do the alcohol extraction first, that breaks down the water soluble components. So you put it in, you make a tea with it first. And then, you know, it's real concentrated tea. I'll put that in a jar. I'll put a little bit of alcohol in it to help as a preservative, because that's then going to sit in the fridge for like 6 weeks while the mushroom is then placed in grain alcohol or some kind of, you know, high octane liquor. And then after 6 weeks, I'll mix the two. Beautiful mushroom, just a really amazing mushroom. Here's another one that is both medicinal and edible. In this picture here, we have a bear's head tooth, Hericium americanum. There's another Hericium in our area called lion's mane, Hericium erinaceus. These are really yummy mushrooms. They're, as you can see, they don't have gills or a polypore surface. They have these tendrils. We call it a toothed mushroom. And the spores occur on those tendrils and just blow off in the wind. And that's how they get around and propagate. Grow on wood, summer to fall. Culinarily, people say that they taste kind of like crab meat. Like I say, it tastes like mushroom to me. I kind of see what people mean when they say it tastes like crab meat. The way to cook this mushroom, if you ever are lucky enough to have any of it, is to put it in a dry skillet. Don't put oil in the skillet. Put it in a dry skillet on around a medium or an under medium heat for a little while, and keep a good eye on it and keep it moving, because it has a lot of water in it. And putting it in that dry skillet, the water will start to cook out. And then after a certain point, when you can kind of tell that the water is cooked out and evaporated, then put a little oil in it and kind of get a crisp on there, and saute it however well you want to. Sometimes it can be difficult to not burn the tendrils when you're trying to cook through the more massive part at the middle. Medicinally, what this mushroom is known for is supporting they call it nerve growth factor in your brain, and then also myelin, the sheath that goes around your nervous system, around your nerves. So it is used by folks recovering from traumatic brain injury. It's used in formulas to try to slow down the onset of Alzheimer's. It's used, basically as a generally supportive of neurological and nervous system functioning. I'm going to stop my screen share again here. Oh, by the way, that picture was App Voice's Tennessee field coordinator, Bree Nicely, found that that Hericium there in the woods in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park just here over the weekend. I visited one of my mushroom gardens over the weekend, and I had some lion's mane and some Hericium growing there. So this is lion's mane. You can see it kind of grows as one big like pom-pom sort of. And then here's a good Hericium. Bunch of tiny little pom-poms. These are just beautiful mushrooms. A lot of fun, these mushrooms. I've got some reishi here. This is some of my hemlock reishi. It's a lot of work to process this because it's so woody. I have destroyed lots of steak knives cutting this mushroom up, and then putting it in my dehydrator. So there's the slices of the hemlock reishi, and then here's the Ganoderma lucidum. You know, looks incredibly similar, but this is the variety that I've ordered from Japan. There's another type that does grow here on hardwoods called Ganoderma curtisi. I've not found that very often, but just this past summer there was a beautiful one growing on a maple tree in my friend's house in Asheville. So I had found that, but the hemlock reishi is much more common. All right. Any questions before I hop back? Oh, there's one. Do young reishi only form in the spring, or can they appear at this time of year? I saw some very young mushrooms that look similar to reishi just this past weekend. Molly, did they have the red color to them yet, or were they just that white, like primordia starting to emerge from the wood?
It was mostly just the white. There was a little bit of that red varnish on top, kind of like the cuticle of a nail, but they were pretty small and pretty young.
And it was on hemlock?
It was on a dead tree, like a standing dead snag that had so much bark gone that it was kind of hard to tell.
Yeah. I don't know for sure. It seems plausible that they could start growing if the conditions were right, and they just would not make it. You know, they would just start, and that particular mushroom would not reach maturity. And it's important to note too that a mushroom is like the fruit. It's the fruiting body. It's not the organism. The vast majority of the organism is the mycelium, which is kind of like the root structure of the mushroom, so in the case of the hemlock reishi, you know, the mycelium is all in the tree. So it may try to make a fruit this late in the year, and it just not work out, and conserve all its mojo in the mycelium, and, you know, try again next summer to make more fruits. The reason I asked if it had any of that red on it or not is because there's a lot of mushrooms that look really similar when they're just at that primordial, like, white, just bubbling out of the tree kind of phase. Well, lion's mane can even kind of look like that sometimes, and a bunch of other Ganodermas look like that. There's one called resinous polypore that looks a lot like reishi when they're first emerging.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Oh, where did we go? There we are. Oh, one of my chanterelle pictures. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. If I had to pick one mushroom and I only was able to have one mushroom, it would probably be chanterelles. They have like almost a fruity, flowery flavor. Some people say a little bit like apricots, or more of a smell of apricots. The flavor is just, it's its own thing. It's delicious. I love chanterelles. I start finding them as early as mid to late June, and I've still found one, found several, not this past weekend, but 2 weekends ago. So fairly long season, but it's really kind of like the second half of July, first week of August is kind of when they're really rocking in our region. There's a bunch of different varieties. They are kind of generally vase shaped, as you can see in this picture on the bottom here, where similar to the oyster mushrooms that we discussed earlier, the stipe kind of just flares out into the cap. There are some varieties that do have a more distinct stalk and cap form to them. But if you're new to mushroom hunting, I would advise to just stay away from those, because those do start to look quite a lot like the jack-o'-lanterns, which we'll get to next. You can see on the top picture there how they'll grow in a really nice patch like that. Not as much in clusters. There'll be 2 or 3 in a cluster sometimes. You can see, you know, these two appear to be growing together. There's maybe 2 or 3 caps coming out of one place there. that might be a couple. And another thing is that, you know, they flare out into this vase and then they get all kinds of curly and crazy. And, you know, so that actually could be just one mushroom. Really delicious mushroom. When you're harvesting chanterelles or most any mushroom, you want a knife and you want to cut it rather than pull it. Unless you're really working on identification, then it's a good idea to actually bring a little trowel and like excavate some of the dirt around it, because there's different identifying features that I won't bother with today because it's more in depth, but that you get from looking at exactly how the mushroom grows into the earth. So these are chanterelles, super, super duper favorite of mine. Jack-o'-lanterns, poisonous. You can see how much that looks like chanterelles right there. The main difference is that they always grow in clusters, and they're growing in association with dead and dying trees. So you'll see them growing generally in clusters right at the base of trees. Sometimes they'll be a little bit further away, you know, but they're growing from the roots of the dead and dying trees. You can see in this picture that the stipe is flaring out a little bit into the cap and the gills, just like chanterelles will, but doesn't usually take that kind of vase shape as dramatically as the chanterelles. It has a more distinct stipe and cap. I neglected to say that with the chanterelles, the underside sometimes is almost perfectly smooth, and sometimes appears to have gills, but on closer inspection, the gills are ridges, which is a pretty subtle distinction between, you know, gills and ridges on the underside of a mushroom until you really start to get familiar with it. So you got to be really careful with hunting chanterelles because of the jack-o'-lantern. I've definitely heard stories about people who've been hunting mushrooms for 10 or 20 years, ending up with one jack-o'-lantern in their chanterelle bag and eating it and getting sick, throwing up all night, having to go to the hospital and getting their stomach pumped. My initial mushroom teacher, this dude named Tim Hensley in Berea, Kentucky, he had this tale where a friend of his had accidentally eaten them, got super sick. And then for several years afterwards, when he would sweat, the sweat was viscous that came out of his knees and armpits. So I don't know what's going on with that mushroom, but I don't want to eat it. But it's pretty magical, pretty amazing. As you can see in this picture on the bottom, the gills of the fresh jack-o'-lanterns are bioluminescent. That's why it has this name, jack-o'-lanterns. So if you find some of these and they're fresh, you know, don't eat them. Don't get them close to the mushrooms you're going to eat. But if you want to harvest them and you know, look at them at night and see if they glow, that might be fun. I've actually never seen it. I actually don't know if it'll work if you harvest them. You might have to find them where they're growing to get that effect. All right, we got about 15 more minutes here. I'm gonna just power through a little bit and then just open it up. Puffballs are another super fun one. No pore surface, no external pore surface. The inside of a puffball is called the gleba, and the gleba starts on almost all varieties as this white kind of marshmallowy or tofu-y type texture, and then gradually turns to mush and then dries out into just powdered spores with this kind of, the skin kind of becomes this brittle shell, and the skin will begin to crack or break in one way or another, and then the wind blows or a raindrop hits it or a squirrel steps on it or something, and this little puff of the spores comes out. It's pretty cool to see. This this picture of me here, these are called Crataegus craniformis, I think, skull-shaped, or skulls, yeah, the skull puffball. I found those a few years ago. I was in the Coal River Valley of West Virginia doing some mine monitoring and community organizing support work for an awesome little community group up there called Coal River Mountain Watch. It's been around for a long time, fighting mountaintop removal and organizing kiddos in that area to do stream cleanups, and did an experimental hemp farm before most people in West Virginia. Just a really cool organization. But I was on my way back home from spending a few days with Coal River Mountain Watch, and I spotted all of those in this fella's yard, and he was out mowing the lawn. So I pulled over and ran, like, don't mow over those. And he was cool about it, and, you know, was really interested in it, and said, oh, sure, you can have those. And so I harvested them and took them home. These ones here, these are like an inch tall. These are called gem-studded puffballs. There's another one called the pear-shaped puffball that's really small, that's, you know, an inch or two big, that I'll find growing out of dead wood. I've had a log where I lived in Berea once, just a downed tree, where over the several years that I lived there, the patch of puffballs kind of gradually moved down the tree. The pear-shaped puffballs were like down around the root flare year one, and I got a bunch, and then year two, the patch showed up in the middle of the tree, and it kind of digested its way towards the top of the tree. It was pretty cool. When you find these puffballs early enough that they have that marshmallowy, tofu-y texture, you can cut through them, and if they're pure white, then they're in an edible phase. If there's any yellowing or discoloration, it's not poisonous, it's just not, it's no good. And I have been like, man, that's mostly good, it'll just turn a little bit yellow, and eating it, and it gave me a stomach ache. So you can learn the hard way too if you want, but you can take my word for it. Also, just only eat it if it's pure white. There is one poisonous puffball called the poisonous pigskin puffball. It's very common in the area. There's really no mistaking it, because when you cut into it, it's black on the inside. I was over the weekend on top of Unaka Mountain in Tennessee, this awesome spruce forest up at about 5,100 feet, and there was these pigskin puffballs just all over the roots of the spruce trees and the bases of the spruce trees. Not going to go into much detail with these, just wanted to be sure to include a couple pictures because they're just so beautiful. In most mushroom hunters seem to get real excited about the spring because of the morels, and the fall, because chicken of the woods happens big time in the fall, even though that kind of happens all year. But in like July and August, the diversity of the mushrooms in our woods, Central Appalachian mixed mesophytic forests, we're just so lucky to live in a place like this. These mushrooms are just so, the colors and the forms of them is just wild. So the coral mushrooms and the jelly mushrooms are some of the weirder ones. That coral mushroom picture right there really looks like it's underwater. That's just a mushroom growing out of the ground. I forget what that particular one is, that purple one. I found it this year at Keokee Lake in Virginia. It's very difficult for me to distinguish most coral mushrooms. There's one called the crown-tipped coral that grows out of wood that I can positively ID and that I eat. Doesn't have a whole lot of substance to it. It's just really beautiful in a dish. But mostly I just like to admire the coral mushrooms. And then that particular jelly mushroom there is called snow fungus, or just white jelly mushroom. That is edible. And it's very similar to black fungus or wood ear, which if you ever get like hot and sour soup at a Chinese restaurant and there's these little black kind of fleshy strips in there, that's what that is the wood ear or the black jelly mushroom. The snow fungus is medicinal as well. It's acts as, how would you say it? Like kind of like a cardio. It helps break up plaque in your vascular system. Yeah, and then it would have a hypotensive action. It helped to lower blood pressure. And I've seen studies where it's theorized that one reason there's so much less heart disease and heart attack and stuff in East Asia is because they eat a lot of jelly mushroom in soups and in their diet over there. We also over here eat a ton of fried food, which probably doesn't help with the whole heart disease, heart attack situation. Okay, a few resources I want to share, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I mentioned Sharondale Mushroom Farm. I bought stuff from them, spawn, you know, and used it to grow mushrooms. Really good stuff. Everything Mushrooms in Knoxville is probably the main place I get stuff. Spawn, that spawn and grow supplies and stuff. Asheville Fungi sells similar stuff. Hernshaw Farms, I'm not particularly familiar with. I just wanted to see if there was a mushroom supply place in West Virginia, and that's what showed up. And if you're in, you know, follow me if you're in Southwest Virginia or Northeast Tennessee, or really anywhere in the region, because I travel a lot, but follow Little Dog Forest Farm. And I don't sell supply stuff, but you know, I sell mushrooms. There's great Facebook groups that I've listed there. They're really good for identification. If you're trying to get a mushroom ID'd on any of these groups, be sure to take picture of the top of the mushroom, the bottom of the mushroom, how the mushroom comes out of the ground, the tree that the mushroom's near. If you know how to identify the tree, say what kind of tree it is, you know, the condition. You got to kind of give a lot of information. There's definitely a lot of people just fling mushroom pictures into these groups, and then other people are like, yeah, man, I have no idea. But if you give a lot of context, then there's some pretty helpful people on these groups that have a good time helping one another learn mushrooms. My initial field guide I used was the Audubon field guide. I don't have it anymore because I set it down on the forest floor once when I was looking at some mushrooms, just totally walked away from it. I actually did that twice because I did that and then found it in the woods later when I was looking for mushrooms, but then I did it again and I haven't seen it for years. I use Mushrooms of West Virginia and Central Appalachia a lot. That's a really good book. And then Mycelium Running is not a field guide. It's just a book about how awesome mushrooms are. And I think that's the whole slideshow here. So here is, this is the West Virginia and Central Appalachia mushrooms, and that's jack-o'-lantern on the front. Really good image of jack-o'-lantern. This is another really good one, macrofungi associated with oaks. Quite a lot of our mushrooms are associated with oaks. It's really fun to hunt mushrooms in forests that have a lot of oaks. And then another good one, if you're really wanting to get into the weeds, is called Mushrooms Demystified. This is not a very helpful book if you want to like find a picture that looks like the mushroom you have, but it is a helpful book that if you want to really, really key it out. And it gets really confusing. It's not as easy as with trees where it's like, are the leaves alternate or opposite? It's like, is the color is a tan to brown, but sometimes it's not. It's just it's really confusing stuff, but this is the best book for that. So let's talk about whatever y'all want to talk about. Squirrel picked up the guide, took it away. Yeah.
Yeah, Willie, there are a couple of questions that came in as you were talking. Is there an app that can help identify mushrooms?
I don't know of one. If anybody finds one, please let me know. I've learned of some apps like that for plants, and none of those even seem to be that great from what I've experimented with. But really, the Facebook groups actually are really helpful. So I'd recommend just hopping on the Facebook group for your state or for a nearby state, and that's pretty helpful. Are any of the corals poisonous? I think so, but I don't know. It's important to know what you know and know what you not know, you know, with mushrooms. If I'm not mistaken, I've had a similar thing with corals that I had with that false morel, where I was seeing, you know, poisonous, and then indications that it is in fact eaten, you know, in other parts of the world. The crown-tipped coral is the only one that I mess with. It grows, it's very small. I'm sorry I don't have a picture here. Maybe I can share it with all the registrants after the fact over email or something, but it grows off of wood, and the tip of each little piece of it has 3 or 4 tiny little prongs on the top. And that's the distinguishing factor. So that one's, it's got some lookalikes, but if you got like a jeweler's loop to where you can look real close, or a magnifying glass, you can ID that one out. There's a website called, I think it's called Hunter Angler Cook, you know, and where somebody's just really into their foraging, their fishing, their hunting, and their culinary pursuits. And that guy's got a good description of the crown-tipped coral and how he likes to cook it. Are there any mushrooms over around Vinton, which is Roanoke, for any of y'all who may not know, that can cause harm just by touching it? I'm not aware of any, but you know, anybody can be allergic to anything. And there's definitely people who are much more sensitive digestively to even edible mushrooms, you know, so I can't decisively say that it's 100% safe for every individual to touch every mushroom, you know. The chicken of the woods, by the way, you know, choice edible, but that one disagrees with some people when they eat it, particularly if you have an alcoholic beverage with it. Some people get a little bit of an upset stomach from it. Okay, there seem to be more mushrooms in Northern Virginia this past summer. Do they grow in cycles, or is it weird weather, or is there a particular reason why there might be more plentiful at some times than others? Well, like I mentioned with the hemlock reishi, we have a ton of that right now because our hemlocks are dying. In general, what makes mushrooms pop is, you know, wet and warm. And exactly how wet and exactly how warm, you know, varies from mushroom to mushroom. That's why, you know, morels still want it to be a little bit cool, so we have those early. But then in the summer, we have just tons and tons and tons. So the best time to go mushroom hunting is between like May and October, if there's been a good rain, like a good hard rain, and then it got warm. Maybe a good rain for a day or two, and then it got warm for a day or two. That's most likely time to find a lot of different mushrooms. Oh yeah, let me scroll back up to that photo. Bree asked, how much of my life have I spent hunting and growing mushrooms? Sometimes it's a lot, especially when I'm single. Let's see. Well, so that picture's downloading. When you pick mushrooms, will they grow again in the same location? Yeah, often. And that's one reason that I'm told anyway, that you want to cut it rather than pick it. I've been told, I don't know that this is true. Scientists haven't told me this, just other foragers have told me this, that when you pick mushrooms, it can like shock the mycelium in a way that can set the mycelium back. Whereas if you cut it, then it doesn't damage the mycelium. Eventually they'll eat through whatever substrate, you know, they're eating. This past year, my most reliable morel spots were pretty slim. Previous several years, I was getting, you know, 100 or so morels out of these two different spots, and this year I got like 30. So I don't know what that was about. With the ones that grow on wood, like chicken of the woods, you know, or hen of the woods, we didn't talk about. They'll come back until they've eaten through all of the particular substrate, you know, in that wood. But I'll get chicken of the woods sometimes from the same place. Not like every time I find it, it's there the next year, but sometimes it'll be there for 2 or 3 years. Okay, let me see if that picture's here. I think I'll have to follow up, Pam, offline about that picture. It's not wanting to download. Not a nearby park where they grow in a fairy circle. Is that caused by something under the ground that's not visible above the ground? The fairy circle is when you find a ring of toadstools. And it's just a magical looking thing that comes up in a lawn. I don't know much about it. My understanding of it is that, you know, I showed you that patch of chanterelles, or we talked about how morels grow in a patch. The mycelium is kind of all over the place and just happens to put up mushrooms at just the places where the conditions are just so for it to want to put up the mushrooms. But what happens with the fairy ring is that the mycelium mat has a central point, and it flares out as far as it can go and then puts up the mushrooms. That's why that forms as a circle, is because it's kind of reaching out to its particular radius and then putting up its fruit. Well, we're at 4:02. Would be happy to try to help with some pictures or any follow-up questions and stuff over email after this, or message Little Dog Forest Farm on Instagram. That's a good way to talk to me about mushrooms as well. Some mushrooms grow in one single night. I think so, kinda. Yeah, I don't know. I gotta go though. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that, actually. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up. If you have any follow-up questions or any thoughts or feedback you want to give us, I'll go ahead and put my email in there again. It's just my name, Maggie@appvoices.org. Willie's email is willie@appvoices.org, which he added there. So feel free to reach out, and thanks again for showing up. It was great. Thanks, Willie.
Yeah. Bye, y'all.
All right, thank you.